Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com, and in this video I'm going to be answering a subscriber question about Windows Server licensing, and in particular how cores work with that licensing. So I want to thank Karl Question, and my apologies Karl if I've butchered your name, for asking this question in the comments of the video I made about Windows Server Karls. And the question is, can I explain the core licensing aspect a bit more? And the example given was, you have 4 physical machines, and each physical machine has a single processor, and each single processor has 16 cores. And there's also a parameter given of that all 4 of these single processor 16 core machines are going to be hypervisors, and each hypervisor would have 6 VMs on it, and each VM is going to be running Server 2019. So that seems pretty complex, but when you look at the documentation and such about server licensing for Windows Server, it's actually pretty easy to figure out. You just have to take the time and check out the documentation and calculate it, quite frankly. So what I'm going to do is first go into a little bit of background about Windows Server licensing and highlight a couple of details with it, and then I'll deep dive into Karl's question and hopefully have a clear answer as far as what licensing would be required for that scenario. So without further ado, let's jump in and dig into some Windows Server core licensing. Before I deep dive into Karl's question, I want to show you my source of information for the core licensing. And this is important because, as I'm pretty sure I mentioned in the Cal video, there's this idea that Microsoft licensing can be really complex and terrible. And I'm sure there are instances where that's true. In my experience, if you take the information that's available, read it slowly and literally, there's some clarity that can be found that can save you a good bit of stress, especially if you're dealing with a reseller that might not know really what's going on with Microsoft licensing, and they say, oh, you need X number of cores. You can say, well, wait, according to this document I need Y number of cores. Why are you telling me I need this other number of cores? And so sometimes what I have found with my own experience dealing with Windows Server licensing, having that conversation between a couple of parties can eventually lead to the truth. And then my experience has been the truth pretty much comes back to what Microsoft actually has published for licensing. Now, kind of the scope of this is your kind of home lab, small, medium business kind of thing. I have not dealt with Microsoft Enterprise agreements, so there may be some different rules for that, but this is based off of what's published. And in my experience with the small business, this tends to be what applies the most to that. So the page I'm on, you can find by going to Microsoft.com and clicking your way through. Probably the fastest way is to go to Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever your favorite search engine is, and just search for Windows Server 2019 licensing, and that'll land you to this page that gives a little bit of information about licensing additions. This discussion is going to deal with standard and data center licensing. I'm not going to go into essentials, nor am I going to read this page to you, but there's something that I do want to bring your attention to. In the edition overview, or not edition overview, in the features, one of the things to understand between data center and standard for Windows Server is Data Center Edition allows for an unlimited number of operating system environments. So basically an unlimited number of VMs running Windows Server. This does not apply to VMs running Linux or some other operating system, just to Windows Server. The standard edition of Windows Server allows for 2 operating system environments, or 2 VMs. And the thing to remember with that is, if you are using the 2 Windows Server VMs granted to you by Windows Server Standard, as it mentions down here, basically the physical server itself can only be a hypervisor. You're not going to get 3 Windows servers out of it. You're running your 2 VMs, and then you're also running a file server on the physical server that's the hypervisor for it. You get you run the hypervisor and you get 2 VMs versus data center will be unlimited. And for one of the scenarios that Karl talks about, that's going to come into play. In my opinion, one of the most important documents that you find on this page is actually at the bottom, and it's a link to the Server 2019 licensing data sheet. I'm going to bring that up here. And again, it has more information about some of the features and such that you get. It does have some pricing information here. I would not take this pricing information to heart. You would want to deal with whoever your Microsoft reseller is for pricing. But the piece that I want to bring your attention to is the data center and standard edition per core licensing little table here. And this is the meat and potatoes of the whole discussion. And there's 3 things that you have to keep in mind with Windows Server and core licensing. First of all, it only cares about the physical cores on a machine. Let's say you're wanting to run a VM and you give that VM like 20 virtual cores. That doesn't matter as far as whatever licensing you have to have for Windows Server. That may be different with other products. I'm not sure. I have the most experience with just Windows Server licensing versus some of the other products. But for just Windows Server, physical cores are what matter. So when licensing your physical cores to properly license Windows Server, each processor on that server, you must have a minimum of 8 core licenses per processor. Minimum is the key thing here. I've never seen a maximum license from Microsoft, in which kind of makes sense. Microsoft will be happy to sell you however many licenses you require, but there are minimums. So if you have, let's say you have a server with with 2 processors, and those 2 processors have 6 cores each. Well, even though you don't have 8 cores per processor, when you license Windows Server for it, you must have enough licensing for 8 cores per processor. The other piece of this, and this kind of goes hand in hand, is you must have a minimum of 16 total cores licensed per server. So in the example of a server with 2 6-core processors, for each processor you would have to buy 8 core licenses per processor, giving you that 16 total cores per server. If you had a server that had a single processor and that single processor had 6 cores, you would still need to get 16 core licenses, because per server you have to license 16 cores worth of Windows Server. And unfortunately, that is the way it is. The thing to remember is that licenses are sold in packs. A couple of years ago, when I was dealing with the licensing more, the 16 pack option wasn't available. I would imagine there might be some price savings with that, but I had to buy them in 2 packs. And what I found was, at least for the environment that I had, moving from a per processor license model to a per core license model, I found for the minimums the price to be about the same. Like, I can't recall off the top of my head what the minimum per processor licensing was back during that model. Let's just say it was a minimum of 2 processors. That the cost for that minimum ended up being about the same when I had to buy the minimum number of cores for, at the time, Server 2016 core licensing. Now, if you were licensing processors that were far beyond what these minimum license requirements are for Server 2019, then yeah, you're probably going to be paying more money. But for servers that were using the minimum licensing, I found the pricing moving from cores to per processor to be about the same. So in just a moment, I'm going to dive more into Karl's question. I recommend, if you're not used to dealing with server licensing, you might want to have this PDF up maybe in another window while you're watching the explanation, you might find that helpful for you. So at long last, we dive into Karls' question. So jumping into Karls' question, the first part of it asked, let's say I have 4 physical machines, and each physical machine has 16 physical cores with 1 CPU. All right. So my little spreadsheet here, we have 4 physical machines. Each has, not 2, 1, not 21. Where's my, there we go. 1 processor, and there are 16 cores per processor. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, when you're licensing the machine, do you have the minimum? And so if we reference our per core licensing document here, we see that he meets the minimum. There's a single processor on the machine. You have to license at least 8 cores of that. Each processor would have 16 cores, and you have to have a minimum of 16 cores per server, no matter how many processors you have, and so that's being met. So total cores per machine, this is simply a formula multiplying these two cells together. Of course, 16 times 1 is 16. Cores are sold in the 2 packs, also a 16 pack, but I'm calculating this for 2 packs, and so for each machine he needs to license 16 cores. So that would be, the number of cores divided by 2, so he would need 8 2 packs. All 4 of the machines are identical. They each have the single processor with 16 cores, and so to properly license all 4 machines for Windows Server, he would need 8 2-pack license packs per machine, so a total of 32. E2 times A2 there. He would need a total of 32 2-packs to fully license all 4 of the machines in this scenario. If you're curious, that would be total cores being licensed would be 64. Kind of expanding on this, let's say that he had 4 machines, each with a single processor, but that single processor had only four physical cores. Well, unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to do this. Simply change the 16 here to a 4 and see, I only need to get 2 2-packs per machine and 8 2-packs in total to get all this, because this does not meet the minimum requirements, because it says here, remember that each processor has to have a minimum of 8 core licenses, and the overall server has to have a minimum of 16 core licenses. So the spreadsheet wouldn't quite work for that. You would basically have to bump this up to where you would either change this to 8 and the number of processors to 2, or 1 and 16, because you have to get to that minimum licensing. Now, let's say that on his machine he had 2 processors, and each processor had 12 cores in it. All right, so each machine has a total cores of 24, so that's meeting the minimum, but you have to purchase past the minimum there. Each processor on the server has 12 cores. That meets the minimum, but we have to license past that. You're not having to license twice. You don't buy the licenses for the processor and then buy them again for the server. Once you've hit the minimums, what you're counting are the total number of cores on the server. So in this example, 24 cores, you divide that by the number of license packs required, and that would take 12 license packs. You have 4 identical machines, so you would have to buy, in this example of each machine having 2 processors, 12 cores each processor, you would be buying a total of 48 2-packs of licenses. So the second part of his question was about the VMs himself, and it says all 4 of the servers are going to be hypervisors, and there are 6 VMs each. And he mentions that the VMs will be Server 2019, and we're not talking about RDS or SQL, just straight up Windows Server licensing. So let me change this back to the single processor with 16 cores. Okay, so here is where the other piece of licensing Windows Server comes in. So if I were to go back to that page and it talks about, and go to the licensing editions, it talks about the number of operating system environments, or basically VMs. It says Windows Standard allows for 2, Windows Data Center is unlimited. So in this example, so let's say I'm going to just type another field here, per server VMs, and he's planning on having 6 VMs per server. Each Windows Server Standard license. So for this single machine, we've bought 8 2-packs of licenses, and so that would be a one fully licensed Windows Server Standard. That Windows Server Standard full license allows you 2 VMs. So for the one server to properly license 6 VMs, he would need to have 3 Windows Server Standard licenses. So what he would have to do is, per machine, he would need to buy a total of 8 times 3, 24 2-packs of licenses, because the first 8 packs that he's bought, which covers 16 cores, will allow him 2 VMs. And if he wants to make VMs number 3 and number 4, he would need to have another 8 2-packs of Windows Core licenses. And then to have VMs 5 and 6, he would have to have yet another. And so basically he will be doing this 3 times. If each server is going to have the 6 VMs, he would need to do all of this 3 times. And so just doing a little math here, that would be number of 2-packs required per machine. That's now going to be 24. And then you would you would multiply that by your number of servers. So that would be 4. So he would have to buy 96 2-packs of licenses. And then that would be the total number of cores that would be licensed there, would be 96 times 2, or 96 times 2, be 192 cores licensed. And the reason why he would have to do that if he used Windows Server Standard is because each Windows Server Standard license allows you 2 Windows Server VMs. Now, if the VMs that he's running, these 6 VMs, are not Windows Server, it's Linux or whatever, this wouldn't apply. Just the basic licensing that we have here would apply. But since he said in his example that each VM is going to be Windows Server 2019, that would be a total of 6 operating system environments of Windows Server 2019. If he's using Windows Server Standard, then he would have to have 3 full Windows Server Standard licenses per server that would be running 6 VMs. So in this example, he will be running a total of 24 VMs, because he said he wants to have 6 VMs on each physical machine. Thus, to license everything, he would have to have a total of 192 cores for all the physical servers licensed. So the question then becomes, all right, that seems like a ton of cores, and I'm having to buy Windows Server Standard licensing 3 times for each machine to be covered for my total of 24 VMs. When should I move to Data Center Edition? What I remember from a couple of years ago, the last time I was working with the reseller and having real pricing to look at, was the magic number, and I call it the magic number, would be right about 13 VMs. So if I had a single Windows server and I was licensing that with Windows Server Standard, when I would be spinning up my 13th Windows Server VM, at that point it would price-wise make more sense to buy a Data Center Edition, which you have the same core calculation, but the edition you're buying is Data Center, it would make more sense to buy data center licenses for that server, because the cost of data center licenses once I hit that 13th VM was actually cheaper than continuing to buy Windows Server Standard licenses that allow me 2 VMs per licensed Windows Server Standard. Now, for this example, it's 6. So my hunch is buying Windows Server Standard might make more sense. But if you have 4 hosts in this example, and let's say that these hosts are decently powered, and so you would have the capacity to have far more VMs, and you actually see the need to have far more VMs, it might make sense to get Windows Server Data Center licensing for that. There's also different features that are available for virtualization with Data Center that you don't have with Windows Server Standard. But as far as and not considering that part of the license, because that's part of the value of Data Center and all that good stuff. But if you're just looking at counting the number of VMs where it makes sense, I believe the magic number is going to be around 13, plus or minus 1 or 2 VMs, because pricing might be different now than it was a couple of years ago. So far we've established per server what the minimum licensing, or not minimum, what the licensing would have to be based on its parameters. And then as far as server VMs, we've determined that each server is going to be licensed 3 times for server standard. Now, the last question that he has been answered, but I want to address it anyway. And he asked, would you be licensing each individual virtual machine and each physical server, or just the 4 physical machines and then reuse their respective license for their VMs? So the answer to the first part, would you be licensing individual virtual machines and each physical server? The answer to that is maybe, which of course is not the clear answer that you want. The licensing applies to the physical server always. When you're counting your cores and such, you're only considering the physical server. But you have to remember, between the 2 editions, Standard and Data Center, Standard allows for 2 Windows Server VMs. Data Center allows for unlimited. So the answer to that question, like I said, is maybe. You would be licensing the number of cores on that physical server, but once you need more than 2 Windows Server VMs, if you're using standard licensing, then you would have to buy that same licensing again to then have 4 Windows Server VMs available to you. And then in this case for 6, he would need to buy the licensing a 3rd time for that server to have the 6 VMs licensed. And then if you chose Windows Server Data Center, then that the number of Windows Server VMs you have for that one physical host doesn't matter. Now, to the best of my understanding, let's say you're in like a clustering situation and you fail over to other hosts. Each host in your cluster, like if you're running VMware, right, and you are running Windows Server VMs and that, you have like the vMotion and all that good stuff, each host in the cluster has to have the appropriate licensing purchased for their Windows Server VMs, which that's where, if you have a lot of VMs, that's where the data center licensing makes sense for that, versus having, let's say you have a cluster of 10 servers and you want to have 6 servers each on that, then that would be for each 10 server you would have to buy 3 server standard licenses, so whatever number of cores required for that, and so that would be 30 Windows Server Standard licenses, on and on and on, versus you have 10 data center licenses. So you have to do that. And then the last part of that question, asking just the 4 physical machines and then reuse their respective license on their respective VMs, the answer to that is yes. So when you license each machine for its, in this case, Windows Server Standard license, then that standard server license grants you 2 Windows Server VMs. And so you wouldn't think, if I want to run 3 VMs, well, you would have to buy another Windows Server Standard license, which now grants you the rights to 4 VMs. Even though you only need to run 3, the licensing you would have that for 4. So, so to Karl, I hope this has answered your question and in a clear way. If it doesn't, feel free to put a comment on the video with clarifying questions, and I'll try to answer it as clearly as I can. For everyone else, I hope you found this useful, and if you did, make sure that you like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also click the little bell so you'll be notified when I put out new content. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you the next time.